Hello and welcome. So today we're diving into what is basically a toolkit for making those really tough choices you run into at work. This is your guide for when the right call isn't obvious, and it's all built around the core ideas of ethical decision-making.
Let's just kick things off with a question I'm sure we've all faced. What in the world do you do when the right path just isn't clear? Ethical dilemmas are almost never black and white. So today, what we're going to do is build a framework that brings some real clarity to all those gray areas. All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we're going to unpack why these decisions feel so difficult. Then, we'll actually lay out a map to help guide you. After that, we'll dive into the 4 key things that influence our choices. And we'll wrap it up by looking at the core principles and values that should be our guide. Okay, let's get into section 1. Why are these decisions so hard to begin with? Before we can even think about finding a solution, we have to really get a handle on what makes the challenge so, challenging. Here's the most crucial point to get. Business ethics is not a math problem. There's no single right answer. It's a problem-solving situation where the rules are often really vague, or even worse, they conflict with each other. There is no magic formula. It just demands sharp, critical thinking on your part. So how do you even know you're facing a real ethical issue? Well, a lot of the time, it starts with that feeling in your gut, right? That sense of guilt or just uneasiness. That's basically your internal alarm system going off. It's the very first clue that you might be heading into questionable territory. Learning to actually listen to that feeling, that's the first step to building real ethical awareness. All right, we've talked about the problem, so now let's get into the solutions. That brings us to section 2, a map for decision-making. Here, we're going to introduce a kind of mental model, a toolkit really, that can bring some structure and clarity when things feel complicated. And here it is. This is your map. Just look at the flow for a second. Over on the left, you've got 4 key inputs: ethical issue intensity, individual factors, organizational factors, and opportunity. All of those feed into that central process of how you evaluate the situation, which then leads to the outcome on the right, your ethical or unethical behavior. So let's break down those inputs. The very starting point for this whole thing is something called ethical issue intensity. Now, in simple terms, this is just how important the decision feels to you, to your team, or to the whole organization. If that intensity is low, you might not even realize you're looking at an ethical issue at all. So what makes that intensity go up or down? Well, as you can see, it's a mix of things. You've got moral intensity, like how much harm could a decision cause? Then there's social pressure from your coworkers, your own personal values and beliefs play a huge role, and of course the immediate pressures of whatever's happening right now. All these things mix together to decide just how intense an issue really feels. Okay, on to section 3, the 4 influential factors. Let's take a closer look at those inputs from our framework, the ones that are shaping every single choice you make, whether you realize it or not. First up are the individual factors. This is everything you personally bring to the situation. For instance, your age and experience might give you more knowledge to handle complex problems. Your education is a factor too. If you're familiar with ethics, you're more likely to see different alternatives. And then there's this really fascinating idea called your locus of control. And this slide just breaks it down perfectly. Ask yourself, do you have an internal locus of control? Do you believe I control my own destiny? Or is it more external, where you kind of feel like you should just go with the flow, because life is shaped by things you can't control? It's pretty easy to see how someone who feels in charge of their actions would tackle an ethical problem way differently than someone who feels powerless. Next up, you never make these decisions in a vacuum, right? Organizational factors are huge. We're talking about the conditions inside your company. The corporate culture, the unwritten rules, the reward systems, all the things that either encourage you to do the right thing or put up barriers against it. So how does a company actually influence you? Well, you can see in this flow, it starts with a mix of rewards. There are internal ones, like feeling good about your work, and external ones, like getting praise or promotion. That feeds into your immediate job context, the people you work with every day. And all of that leads to opportunity, the conditions that either allow for or prevent a certain behavior. Okay, so far we've pretty much described how decisions are usually made. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about how they should be made. And that brings us to section 4, principles, values, and norms. This is all about the guiding ideas that point us toward the best possible choice. So, this normative approach is different from what we just covered. It doesn't just describe what people do, it sets a standard for how they should act. It's all about aiming for ideals, with big concepts like fairness and justice right at the heart of it.
To help us think about what's truly fair, the philosopher John Rawls came up with this really powerful thought experiment. He called it the veil of ignorance. Here's the idea. Imagine you get to create all the rules for a brand new society. But there's a catch. You have to do it from behind a veil, so you have no idea what your own position in that society will be. You don't know if you'll be rich or poor, powerful or on the margins. So what kind of rules would you make? Chances are you design a system that's fair to everyone, especially the least fortunate, just in case that person ends up being you. It's a genius way to remove personal bias from the equation.
Now, organizations take these big ideas and turn them into principles and values. And this slide shows the key difference. On the left, you see the inputs, like specific statements a company might make. These flow into two big buckets. Principles are the firm, widely accepted boundaries for how to behave, the non-negotiable rules. Values, though, are more subjective ideals that guide the organization's goals.
Let's look at this table real quick. A principle is universal. Something like, we will obey all laws. See? It's a hard boundary you don't cross. A value is more about an ideal you're striving for, like we will offer the best quality. It provides guidance. And let me tell you, a strong ethical company absolutely has to have both.
So let's pull all this together. When you can spot an issue's intensity, when you understand the individual and organizational factors at play, and when you ground your thinking in solid principles, well, that's when you empower yourself. You move out of that fog of uncertainty and into the clarity of a really well-reasoned decision.
So here are your key takeaways. Number 1, ethical decisions are complex. There's no magic formula. 2, a structured framework is your best friend for analyzing all the moving parts. 3, you, your company, and the specific situation, they all matter. And 4, those normative principles and values, that's your moral compass.
But let's end on this one crucial point. This framework, this whole model, it doesn't just hand you the right answer. That's not the goal here. The goal is to give you the tools to find a better answer, one that's more thoughtful, more responsible, and a whole lot easier to stand behind.
And that leaves us with one final big question for you to think about. This entire toolkit gives you the how, the process for making a solid ethical decision. But what's going to define your why? What are the core purposes and values that you are going to bring to that process? At the end of the day, that is the question this framework really prepares you to answer.